to be able to model the battle space and to try to stop Ebola. So are you saying that's a good move by Obama? One of the few good moves?
Yes, that was an excellent move, and that was initiated by our military, and Obama agreed to it. But I give full credit to General Martin Dempsey, General Williams, and the AFRICOM units because they initiated this perspective, saying that we have to get in there very quickly, be able to contain the situation, and be able to monitor the entire battlefield of diseases and transfer all of their assets, intelligence assets, to West Africa. Eventually, I would hope that the plane flights from Liberia and Sierra Leone would cease and desist. This is absolute nonsense that United and Belgian Airlines are saying that this helps humanitarian conditions. It does not. We need an isolation. We need a quarantine area, which we have had historically since 1890 when immigrants came into the United States through Ellis Island. We then had a very effective paramilitary organization called the Public Health Service, which I don't see working at all anymore. So instead, the military took over, became very efficient and very effective, and brought along with them Dr. Tony Fauci, who supersedes in capacity and capability Dr. Frieden, who should resign. The CDC should stand down, and now everyone should prepare their respective hospitals for the Ebola outbreak. The Ebola is a nasty virus. Let me give you a comparison. On any unit of blood, there will be an HIV, about 10 million HIV viri or viruses. In Ebola, in contrast, on that same unit of blood, you will have 10 billion Ebola viruses. So as you get sicker, the greater amount of viruses increases exponentially, and it spreads exponentially. So when you had that nurse who came in from Dallas last night to Cleveland, and from Cleveland to Dallas, and then Dallas to Atlanta, she had potentially infected 134 people. That's not additional 134. That's a multiply of 134 because we're not including the vector of the airplane, where there's another 20 people who take care of the airplane, the waiting room, and all that. So what we have is an increasingly exponential epidemic that has to be prepared for. And the CDC was not prepared, was not able to contain it, and neither was, unfortunately, your hospitals in Dallas, which I was absolutely shocked. Because of all the states in the union, I would have assumed that Texas could have handled the problem, and they have not been able. I'm sorry about that.
Well, everybody waited around for the CDC to tell them what to do. It shows how total federalization with this bureaucracy has just turned everybody into jellyfish.
They've been at, honestly, CDC, everybody knows who has to deal with the CDC was a totally ineffective, dysfunctional organization for 20 to 30 years. They are not the primary units that go into a epidemic. The primary units that I would use would always be the military or the paramilitary units of the public health service. So the CDC was only a consulting body that basically could give information to your local hospital, to your county, and your county commissioner or your governor could rescind that recommendation. And clearly Presbyterian Hospital was not prepared, nor were they helpful in assessing the situation. And giving
Dr. Pieczenik, I just read the default laws and regulations. Weren't they supposed to direct Ebola patients to special quarantine BioShield federal facilities where they now are starting to direct them? Why did they allow them into hospitals?
Well, I have no idea. They should have been evaluated a long time ago because this was an issue that's been around since 1976. We knew about the Ebola epidemic already over a year ago in Liberia. I'd been waiting for it, and then that's why the military had been on standby, and they went in there. But in fact, there are only 4 hospitals. One is in Missoula, Montana, where I used to live in Montana and Bozeman. But those 4 hospitals did not contain the number of Ebola patients that will overwhelm the system. In terms of the preparatory status, it was the CDC that claimed every hospital was ready, and Obama claimed that, and that was false.
So you're thinking, I'm about to skip this network break because this subject's so important. Doc, I mean, you believe Sandy Hook was staged. More and more experts have come out and agreed. The Boston bombing, rigged. So many other events, 9/11, the open funding of ISIS, changing the name from Al-Qaeda. All of this is coming out. But when you look at this Ebola situation, I'm not saying it's not ravaging Africa. I'm not saying it isn't, living in the body longer before the symptoms show up, 21 days instead of 3. It's clearly mutating, getting stronger. But I can't believe that this type of ineptitude to bring in Ebola patients, they never did that before, to let people fly in from West Africa, from ravaged areas when other countries had already banned it months ago. I mean, it appears that ineptitude wouldn't be this precise at doing everything they could to grease the skids for Ebola. Are you getting any information on them allowing this to spread, to kind of bring in a medical tyranny, to create a political distraction? Are there any motives for this to be a false flag?
No, not really, because number one, it is very hard to create an epidemic to create a false flag. Newtown was a false flag because Eric Holder had funded a very dysfunctional governor and a dysfunctional town and a bunch of Connecticut state troopers who were just pathetic. And it was easy to create, and the scenario was nonsense. This is somewhat different. We've seen Ebola, and the Doctors Without Borders have been dealing with it for decades. The problem is that really the ineptitude and the fact that they're coming into Liberia has more to do with money superseding the ability of the U.S. government to cease and desist. In other words, United Airlines refuses to stop flying. In particular, Belgian and Air France stops flying because they make money. They don't want to stop their planes from flying into Liberia and Sierra Leone. I would put a quarantine zone immediately. That's why I would hope that our U.S. military would impose what's called a quarantine or cordon sanitaire. I really don't care at this point that Liberians come to the United States, because any Liberian like Mr. Duncan is coming to the United States for only one purpose, and that is medical care. He knew very well the minute he came in here that he was infected. And in turn, he didn't really care whether he infected everybody else. The notion that the symptoms don't come out until 21, that's absurd. And Frieden knows that's absurd, because this virus, like the AIDS virus, which, by the way, the CDC could not handle, that's why this is a history of incompetency on the behalf of HHS, CDC, the president. These are incompetent institutions that have been funded, and you're correct, you don't want to pay for them. They could not handle AIDS. Ebola, like AIDS, is an RNA virus, which is highly dangerous and mutates very quickly. So immediately that we find a vaccine like we did on AIDS, that will mutate. It'll change so rapidly that it took us years, and Tony Fauci, as National Institute of Infectious Diseases, to be able to contain it. Now, having said all this, you can't create a massive panic. On the same hand, you can't use this for some type of political correctness. I would create a quarantine. I would not allow any flights from Sierra Leone, Liberia. I would let our AFRICOM handle the situation there. I would close off all flights and then make sure all hospitals were prepared, because we're now in the flu season, which means that everybody who's going to go into the hospital or the emergency room is going to come in with symptoms of fever, headaches, nausea, and the doctors have to be prepared, as well as the nurses, to know the difference between Ebola and the flu, and that's going to be a problem. But having said that, I have full faith that somehow America comes out of it. That's my wishful thinking.
Sure. As a medical doctor, Dr. Pieczenik, who's been all over the world and taught NBC type classes and things, I know in the military, when you were in the military previously, what does your gut tell you? I'm no epidemiologist. I'm not a virologist, but if you've got people flying who are infectious, if you've got other Africans being issued visas to come in here from West Africa, undoubtedly, there are probably going to be hundreds of people now that end up coming down with Ebola. And if they don't immediately contain them, it'll be thousands. I think there's a pretty good chance we're going to end up with some type of epidemic. Do you disagree with that, or what's your gut tell you?
We are in the incipient phases, the beginning phases of an epidemic. Remember, an epidemic means that it initiates at one point. It started with one man, spread to 2 people, then you have 130 on a plane, you have another couple of hundred on other planes. So this is going to be spread very quickly. Now, if you would ask me which city in the United States would have had an Ebola population, I would not have guessed Dallas. I would have said New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, and it wouldn't take very hard for me to place a Liberian or Sierra Leonean on a plane to go to any one of those cities and to create an epidemic of Ebola. So the consular officers in the State Department have to cease and desist giving visas. I think there has to be a quarantine. The notion that customs officials can put up this nonsense temperature and gauge it and say that they don't have Ebola, or that Ebola only comes out when there's a fever and they're sweating, that's absolute nonsense. It's an RNA virus. We know it transmits very quickly. And if Dr. Frieden knows differently, and he says it differently, he has no idea of molecular biology, which he didn't know about in HIV, which is also an RNA virus.
Sure, they said it was anti-gay to want to quarantine people in 1979, 1980, 81. If they would have done that, we wouldn't have millions of Americans dying from AIDS.
Correct, and that was the fault of the CDC. And they had no idea of what they were talking about.
And now we're against West Africans if we don't want Ebola. So I guess like we have bug chasers that want to get HIV, maybe to prove you're politically correct, maybe young women should go out and ask Liberians to give them Ebola.
No. Let's not get too fastidious. The issue is it's really quite simple. We have an effective military. We have the right constitutionally to invoke quarantine at any point we want. We actually, in fact, did that, Alex. In the 1900s, when we had immigrants coming in from all over the world, we had the public health service, the military being able to sequester immigrants coming in, put them on Ellis Island for 4 to 5 weeks with all kinds of diseases, cholera, typhus, smallpox, chickenpox, and then by the time they exhibited and manifested the symptoms on Ellis Island, they were then allowed to come back into the United States.
Made total sense, but nowadays that would be called homophobic or racist. We should accept all of the Ebola patients, and if other countries are all banning people from West Africa, the U.S. will become the repository of everyone fleeing, and then I think it's a guarantee that we're going to get an Ebola pandemic out of the epidemic if this continues. How do you think the CDC and Obama and others are thinking they're going to get away with their clear stand down, whether it was from incompetence or on purpose? It doesn't really matter. It's criminal negligence, in my view, Dr. Pieczenik. I don't know what they're thinking. I mean, if you're right that they're really this inept, and I've talked to senior Secret Service folks, I'll just leave it at that have been inside, not just Bongino, but other people, in person, not over any telecommunications, and they tell me that they can't tell me what's going on in the White House, but they say it is over the top. And then they point out what that FBI agent said he saw in the White House when Clinton was there, and they said 10 times worse than that. Well, the stuff that he brought out was over the top. I mean, it sounds to me like Obama and his controllers literally are watching Sports Center and playing golf all day. And so who is running the country, Dr. Pieczenik?
No one. And I said it from day one. Remember, when I first went on your show and I said there was going to be a stand down in Newtown, that he didn't kill Osama bin Laden because bin Laden's been dead for 10 years, I questioned the credibility and the effectiveness of Obama. I still maintain that. The man should never have been president. He's not qualified to be president, and he should resign, and we should have someone else take over. That issue is standing right now. It depends on the American public, on Congress, but we have had an ineffectual Congress. So what happens? In return, our military has the right and has appropriately acted to take over some of the functions that the President of the United States has mismanaged. ISIS, a complete creation of the CIA in our civilian capacity to create wars that we eventually fight against ourselves. I said it in a blog where we're now ending up where ISIS will end up in Baghdad, although some of the military disagree with me. They're on the outskirts of Baghdad. It reminds me of 35 years ago when I was ordered by the Nixon administration to debrief Ambassador Martin in the evacuation of Saigon. And so we have created the monster like CIA created the Viet Minh, Viet Cong, and then eventually the military had to go in, and we lost the war. We've lost another war. We've lost wars after wars after wars. It's not just Obama who's incompetent, Bush Jr., Clinton. So the question is, what does America want, and what is it willing to fight for? We can complain as much as we want, but from day one, when you and I got together 12 years ago, and I've always respected your courage, and your bravery, and some of us call us, out the outlier, and I don't particularly care what they say. Everything you and I have said has come out true.
It really has. Dr. Pieczenik, stay there. I want to finish up on the economy, on North Korea and Russia.
We're on the
Stay
march.
with us.